Welcome to this panel on food and identity in modern France. We have three presenters today, and I'll introduce them in order. This session is being recorded by H France and will be posted to the internet. I think they do them on YouTube and stuff, right? As much for myself as for you, especially since it's being recorded, please make sure your phones are silenced, I'm going to ask you, because, I don't know, so we don't have the interruption. Our first presenter today is Kelly Colvin, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, who received her PhD from Brown University and is currently a member of the Western Governing Council. Since it's our 50th anniversary, I'm emphasizing Western roles in these introductions. Her first book, Gender and French Identity After the Second World War, 1944 to 1954, Engendering Frenchness, 2017, deals with the interplay of politics, popular culture, and gender in the immediate post-war period in France. Her recently released book, Charm Offensive, Commodifying Identity in Post-War France, 2023, is about the global marketing of an idealized French femininity. She's also published articles on voting culture and the politics of beauty in French historical studies and the Journal of Women's History. Today's paper comes from her third book project, Appetite for Greatness, and it's entitled Food Police: Culinary Interactions Between Assistants Sociaux and Immigrant Women in Late 20th Century France.
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. Thanks to the fellow panelists. I'm not sure if the mic is on. I always feel, I have to use these at work, and I always feel like a failed pop star for many reasons. So in 1980, the staff of a Centre Social, this government-run community center at the Rue de Tanger in Paris, was highlighted a major government publication about public assistance and food. One major article in the publication featured a picture of a white woman cooking, watched by two women of color, and it was accompanied by the caption, quote, "to adapt migrant women to French cuisine customs." The Centre, its director assured readers in an interview, had focused on issues of food and nutrition for several years now. The director described its tactics as multi-pronged. It offered courses in cooking and nutrition, and it also hosted what she called one-day alimentation extravaganzas every trimester. Importantly, she reported that the center was very involved in educating these, quote, migrant women about nutrition and food, with meetings every other week at the center in small groups, as well as sending female workers into homes. In addition to all of these efforts, the director noted that the Centre would include nutritional information along with money every time they dispensed it to families in need. While reactions to the influx of immigrants to France were decidedly mixed, this paper shows that food can demonstrate the subtext and biases of a nation in the midst of a period of change. If, as Namisha Barton argues, citizenship is a lived experience and not simply a stamp on a piece of paper, although that stamp is certainly important as well, food surely plays an outsized role in the creation and maintenance of citizens in a nation like France, so integrally associated with its food culture. During the 1950s and 60s, migration to France from former and current colonies boomed as the country's need for workers grew alongside the post-war economic miracle. These workers tended to be younger, male, and, in the hopes of people on many sides of the equation, temporary. When the global economy slowed in the 1970s, this more relaxed attitude towards immigrants eroded quickly, and rhetoric about the impossibility of multiculturalism heightened. A new wrinkle, however, came in 1974 when, in the midst of a deepening economic crisis, the government suspended immigration for labor. At nearly the same time, though, the government affirmed the right of immigrants to be reunited with their families in France, meaning that just as the economy slowed down, a new wave of immigration occurred, one whose public face was now female. As sociologist Jane Friedman put it, the arrival of women was linked in the French perception to the, quote, sedentarization of the immigrant community, with the idea of immigrants' return to their country of origin being replaced by a project of settlement in France. The highest number of women arrived in France in the early 1980s, and by 1990, women's immigration rates had run so high that they made up nearly half of all immigrants. Just as potent, while the numbers of immigrants began to stabilize over the 1980s and into the early 1990s, their origins had shifted from European immigrants to North and Sub-Saharan African immigrants. How can we actually see how people felt towards this population? Food gives us many insights, and I'm going to look at, first, official social workers and their attitudes towards women and food, and then look at how newly arrived women themselves reacted to the more intrusive judgments, both with coping strategies and some ingenuity. We return to the Rue de Tanger director. She adopted a somewhat appalled tone when describing the origins of the centre's focus on food, which had to do with what she purported to be an utter lack of knowledge about nutrition, food safety, and diet on the part of, quote, migrant mothers. The Centre, in her telling, decided to undertake this nutrition and cooking effort when they realized that migrant mothers were dropping off their children for care with unsuitable snacks, such as small amounts of soup, moldy bottles, or just 3 yogurts. At first, she recalled, when the social workers, the assistants sociales at the center, broached the subject of food education, the mothers were uninterested or felt like maybe it was taboo. Rather than ceding the point, the Centre couched it a bit, integrating culinary education into other programming. This strategy was quite successful, she reported, for now mothers openly came to them with questions about food. One mother, she said, had been told to make her child a potage by another agency, but I don't know what this is, the woman said. The director was taken aback. How, she asked, could a woman in France not know how to make a potage? In this telling, the assistant becomes essential to health, but also to assimilation. Being a woman in France equals knowing how to make a potage. The director made clear that these lessons were primarily aimed not at young white women, but at young women from North and Sub-Saharan Africa. These women's perceived need for instruction was apparently heightened when a new teacher at the center, who was training young women about daily life in France, was, quote, dumbfounded by their ignorant responses to questions about food. The teacher came to them, the director said, and begged the center to do something about this insupportable situation. However, the director realized quickly, she said, that a centre-based approach became limited. It was hard for young women to put into practice the lessons they were learning, especially since their homes were not properly equipped, she said. Hence, the Centre decided to conduct a series of home visits, all centered on this subject of food. In the sessions at the Centre, teachers now told the women that they could come to their homes if they registered a request. And in this way, the director then described the assistante as a sort of border guard, surveilling and evaluating their cultures through food. The home visits were incredibly intense. They involved multiple sessions and hours spent training women how to shop, trips to the grocery store, cooking classes, and preparations. Depending on the person who visited, she might even refuse to come in the door. As writer Fanny Deschamps recalled, when she visited the apartment of a woman called Fatma, who had offered them mint tea, her assistante partner stepped inside gingerly in what Deschamps described as her racist reflex. Okay, it is clean in here, the partner said with relief. You can come in. We can sit down, and it will be okay to accept the cup of tea. Deschamps saw no such hesitation when it came to visiting any white French families. At the end of the visit, her partner turned to Deschamps, aware of her reactions, and sneered, "You won't even have the nerve to write that, will you? They're saturated with dirt. They're bad mothers. No, the social workers come to see these happy little Arabs in their hovels to restore their morale." So in this way, food really becomes a way to understand real attitudes towards immigrants. At first, the assistante would take the mère de famille shopping, for most often, we are told, she doesn't know anything about vegetables. As a follow-up, she would give a lesson in how to prepare them, and especially, and this is key, how to prepare them for children. As one assistante described it, we prepare the vegetables then, and I force the child to eat them, thereby assuming the mother's role in her own home. The mothers, she told us in this publication, talked about how the children would only eat the vegetables that the assistante had prepared, for they were such wonderful cooks. This problem, the assistante described it, was due to the fact that the mothers themselves did not actually know how to cook the vegetables well enough, and that was why their child could not eat them. Or, she continued, they don't know enough French to understand nutrition and nutrition information. The problems began at birth, the workers reported, for the immigrant mothers breastfed for a shorter duration in France than at home. Breastfeeding was a controversial topic for all women in France during this time, linked to women working and fears of lost connection. In the case of immigrant women, discourses around the practice took on a racialized character. Because of this shift toward briefer breastfeeding, according to the assistante, the children of immigrant women were exposed to solid foods earlier, and these were far too spicy. Perhaps worse, she continued, was that women failed to understand French vegetables or milk, and the staff often had to tell them that even if they must continue with their cuisine traditionnelle, it is at least essential to give their children the maximum amount of milk to avoid these health and diet problems so common to people of their ilk. As assistante Madeleine Prudhomme remembered in her memoir, this type of counsel from the assistantes was absolutely essential. She described one of her clients, Madame Raissa, who had come to a breastfeeding consultation in a pericentre with her fourth baby, lethargic, discouraged, incapable of internalizing the advice of the pediatrician. As such, the centre provided her with a way of melding. Another common pitfall of young migrant women in France, as we are told by assistantes, was that they lacked self-control in purchasing foods. The staff at the centre, she said, was clear that they must also tell the mothers to avoid excessive spending because they have very limited means. The problem is that once they've spent all their money, they only eat couscous, sometimes rice with oil and a little tomato juice. The assistante felt this was incredibly problematic, for it could lead to serious malnutrition. Migrant women needed to practice economizing, she told us, but the assistante worried that this was very rare amongst all of the women that she encountered. Just this past April, she recounted, I saw a woman without money who had bought a kilo of strawberries for 23 francs. So, she went on, it was the charge of assistants to educate them on nutrition, but this should, in these cases, be accompanied by personal development. The assistante also argued that the women had to develop self-control in the realm of consumption. The world today was entirely saturated with ads for cakes and cookies, but we needed to learn to say no for ourselves and our children, she said. These women need to attain a certain equilibrium, a certain serenity around sweets. Unfortunately, she continued, there are lots of women who dare not say no. They don't want to look cheap. If we were to look in their carts, we would see products that are not only expensive, but also that contribute little to their nutritional health. Without discipline in spending, she said, nutrition and family finances would be destroyed. One staff member offered a specific example of a seemingly incompetent mother. I'm thinking about Madame K, she said, whose husband is unemployed, who actually turned to us and said, I'm not going to deny my kid a pain au chocolat as well because of that situation. For the assistante, food seemed like a real problem for immigrant women. It's something that weighs on them, she said. If I give them simple recipes, they say things like, that will make me gain weight, or if I serve that to my husband instead of steak, he won't like it. So their real problems, she went on, were not necessarily the financial issues one might bump up against in encountering a new country. Rather, she said, they were nutritional. They always want meat with dinner, even if they've eaten it with lunch. And, worst of all, they treat dessert like the major part of the meal. They don't realize that you shouldn't be hungry for dessert. Dessert is considered to be a supplement. I'm just thinking of me devouring peanut M&Ms last night in my hotel. It's fine. Still, one hopeful sign for the assistants was that some of the young women no longer asked for starch recipes. Instead, they wanted some cuisine diététique so that they could slim down and maintain their weight. Indeed, she noted as time went on, the demand became less about nutrition and more about diet. Still, in this realm so inimical to French female identity, the women were sorely lacking without the knowledge about how to slim down or about how to diet properly. In that, the assistante assumed the role of guide of knowledgeable, white French woman. Sometimes the women's living situations also limited their ability to prepare nutritional foods for children. Assistante Prud'homme described a mother of 6 young children living in a one-bedroom apartment with an abusive husband. As she entered the apartment, she said, "I had a reflex to recoil at the threshold of the small kitchen. It was so cluttered that I had no idea where to place my feet without stepping on dirty laundry, a pile of dishes, or a child." It gave off an acrid, nauseating odor. In another case, Prud'homme advocated for an immigrant family in which the father had lost his job and the family was about to lose their HLM apartment due to lack of payment. She reported that a neighbor described it to her, "They all live like savages. They don't speak to anyone. Their gas, electricity, and even water were cut off. How do they even cook? Maybe they just use bottles of water." In all of this information, it seems clear that the assistants often viewed young immigrant women as unequipped at best or incompetent at worst in the realm of food. There's no mention that couscous, for example, a semolina-based grain dish, is a cherished food for many in North Africa, or that babies have thrived in every region of the world for millennia. Rather, food became a discursive marker of French cultural superiority, or perhaps more precisely, the inferiority of other cultures, especially those of immigrants to the Hexagon. On the flip side, contact with the assistants was not particularly pleasant for immigrant women and their families, another element that doesn't really come across in government accounts from French workers. In Jura's famous autobiographical novel, The Veil of Silence, the protagonist's father is arrested on suspicion of aiding Algerian separatists. Her mother, who spoke no French and had no familiarity with French bureaucracy, was forced to quickly fend for herself and become more independent. The family had at one time received assistance for housing from the government, which had permitted them to move to a larger apartment. But for Jura and her mother, collecting help at a centre was a terrible chore. At first, she reported, her mother gradually acquired a certain autonomy. She learned French, went to do her marketing with other ladies from the Cité. For administrative formalities, she used me as an interpreter, as the legal term still evaded her. Those trips to Social Security, to the family allowances, and other public services revealed themselves to be, quote, worse than annoying. There was always a misfiled paper or something. Yes, they have been to France. Still worse, the people who worked at these sites revealed their enmity. The employees behind the counters always received us coldly, quibbling over these infinite details. House visits also presented an annoyance for many immigrant women, another viewpoint that we don't find in some of these archives. In her celebrated novel Fatima, Leila Sabar told of how a mother dreaded visits from social service representatives. The mother had been beaten by her husband, and she in turn had hit her child, prompting the visit. The social worker came by again, Sabar wrote, quote, "My mother made her understand that she didn't need her. She knew about when she would arrive, and she tidied up so that everything would be orderly in the 2 rooms. She camouflaged the stains on the kitchen linens, the dishes were done, the sink was clean, and the table was clear." The social worker, who was part of the Office of Maternal and Hygiene Aid, saw nothing to do. When she saw the clean kitchen, she had nothing to make herself useful. She left with the promise that she would try to return soon. In this way, the mother uses this sort of like language of food and kitchen to outwit the social worker, who can find no evidence of disorder. While for the daughter, the social worker, the daughter's been hit, the social worker appears completely feckless. Still, as portrayed in Bessora's novel, 53 Centimeters, the relationship is inevitably unequal between these two sides. As she puts it, the social worker in these interactions becomes a, quote, mythical priestess in France. And the immigrant protagonist of the book, Zaha, describes herself as feeling, quote, beaten, lost, and defeated when facing the workers' demands. She said, she has all the power. She makes her laws. But people of color, and particularly these women who I'm talking about, were certainly not victims of French intolerance, and these government reports that I've been citing do not reflect these women's efforts to create vibrant lives. These also occurred through food. They formed networks and bonds, defying easy characterization, and presenting examples of resiliency in the face of a culture that was so resistant it must have sometimes felt overwhelming. In these cases, again, food could be a common language. Residents of the Savines HLM in the north of Marseille told of how one woman's cooking pot made the rounds repeatedly, a common vessel for preparing feasts for women whose backgrounds range from France to Cayenne to Guadeloupe. As the pot's owner, Mariama, watched her friends prepare meals, she, quote, watched them talk, laugh, and work, and she reminded herself that life was worth living, all of the joys it could bring. Parallel networks of food arose across France. In northern France, in Maubeuge, close to the Belgian border, Hamida, a divorced woman who was proud of her independence, told an interviewer about her association, Le Palais Gourmand. The association consisted of a group of female friends in similar positions who made cakes that they sold at market to make extra money. In yet another instance, in Saint-Denis, just a few miles north of the Centre Social on the Rue de Tanger, a group of women in one HLM actually started a restaurant on the ground floor of their building. Named Sanina, Berber for female eagle, the restaurant served food from all of their home countries, India, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. And this project was born out of a French language class, in which the women bonded over their love of cuisine. It was not easy to get this restaurant off the ground. As Adjara Ladecal, who helped form the Women's Association of this HLM, reported, we fought for 5 years to obtain subsidies. When you don't have money in France, it's not enough to just snap your fingers. For her part, Zineb, who had worked as a housekeeper, talked about how much she loved working in the restaurant and showing that, quote, immigrants are not just good at cleaning. As Fatou from Senegal, another worker, wrote, we are proud as immigrant women to have set up our own business, and I believe the Cité is also proud of us. In all of these cases, food provides us with a new window into the daily life of people whose existences may fall outside of traditional archives. In the time period covered in this paper, debates about immigration into France raged and grew even more gendered. And for the historian, exploring how newly arrived women navigated life in France can be difficult to access. In this case, food, so intrinsic to identity, especially in a place like France, becomes crucial to understanding the complex life in the hexagon for all people. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jack Murphy, Associate Professor of French at Gettysburg College. He holds a joint PhD in French Studies and Anthropology from New York University. His book, Yearning to Labor, Youth Unemployment and Social Destiny in Urban France, from 2017, is an ethnographic study of strategies of political resistance and social adaptation by young people in the housing projects of Limoges, who struggle in the 21st century with unemployment rates 3 times the national average. His current research investigates how culinary and moral values are attributed to different types of foods and methods of processing foods in France, amid changing notions of class, race, gender, labor dynamics, and national identity. Articles from this project have been published in Food and Foodways and Modern and Contemporary France. Today's presentation continues along this trajectory. Frozen foods, and fat fears, weighing in on cultural identity and economic change in France, 1960s to 2000.
I think it's on. Well, thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thank you to my fellow panel colleagues here. It's really great to be here, and thank you to the audience for coming to this panel. So the French translation of French Women Don't Get Fat, published in 2005, the same year as the original, starkly contradicts author Mireille Guiliano's idealized portrayal of French identity, particularly in its connection to food. While the English version romanticizes French culture as defined by moderation, traditional food practices, and a mindful approach to eating, qualities Guiliano contrasts with the perceived excesses of American life, the very existence of a French edition suggests that these values are at odds with contemporary French realities. The rise of fast food, processed diets, and changing eating habits has contributed to a growing number of French women and men who, contrary to the book's premise, are now grappling with expanding waistlines and related health risks. In fact, obesity in France has been steadily increasing since the 1980s. While it was relatively uncommon at the start of that decade, affecting only about 5% of the population, the rate had grown to around 8% by the mid-1990s. By the time Guiliano's book was published in the mid-2000s, over 15% of French adults were considered obese, and today nearly half of the adult population is classified as either overweight or obese, with those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and certain regions experiencing particularly high rates. The most concerning trend, however, has been the sharp increase among younger age groups where obesity has surged in recent years. Guiliano was not the first French observer to link France's increasing girth to American excess. A growing chorus of medical professionals, politicians, journalists, and academics voiced concern as well, many insisting that, quote, Americanization, end quote, was to blame. Le Monde captured this anxiety with the headline, Obesity, France on the Path of the United States, in 2006, while sociologist Claude Fischler warned of the broader, quote, McDonaldization, end quote, of French food and culture. In these accounts, America's copious rolls of fat were portrayed as both a cautionary tale and a looming threat, symbolizing the dangers of unbridled capitalism, rampant consumerism, and the insidious erosion of traditional French values centered on moderation, pleasure, and communal eating. For professionals in France's frozen food industry, anxiety over fat and the broader decline of traditional French eating habits presented both challenges and opportunities. On the one hand, frozen food could be viewed as part of the problem, a product of industrialization, rationalization, and standardization that conflicted with a culinary heritage emphasizing fresh, artisanal ingredients and the slow, communal enjoyment of meals. On the other hand, the industry had the potential to leverage these concerns by strategically reframing its image. Manufacturers could highlight how freezing preserves the nutritional value of food without the need for additives or preservatives, effectively distinguishing frozen products from other processed options. By promoting the convenience and health benefits of frozen vegetables, fish, and meats, they could appeal to French consumers, increasingly confronted by alarmist narratives about contemporary dietary trends. In this paper, I argue that the frozen food industry's response to concerns over fat and the erosion of traditional eating habits reflects a broader tension between modernization and cultural identity in France. Since at least the beginning of the 19th century, industrialization, rationalization, and standardization have been integral to French food practices, despite their later association with American cultural imperialism. By the end of the 20th century, however, the rise of so-called fat fears and anxieties over the loss of artisanal, slow, and communal foodways prompted a reimagining of French culinary heritage. This redefinition positioned certain practices as uniquely French, even as the nation's culinary identity had long been shaped by global economic forces. The frozen food industry, far from being a passive player in this cultural transformation, both adapted to and helped shape these debates by balancing tradition with modernity. Ultimately, this paper seeks to illuminate how French professionals in this sector navigated the complex relationship between globalization, health consciousness, and national identity, while reasserting their place within a rapidly evolving food culture. So French ingenuity and innovation in the 19th century were pivotal in shaping the foundations of today's industrial food system. Nicolas Appert's invention of canning in the first decade of the century revolutionized food preservation, making it possible to store and transport food over long distances without spoilage. Building on this, Ferdinand Carré's development of refrigeration technology in the 1850s further extended the ability to keep food fresh, while Charles Letellier's pioneering work in mechanical refrigeration enabled the safe global transport of perishable goods, such as meat. Meanwhile, in the culinary world, Auguste Escoffier transformed professional kitchens by introducing introducing a more efficient system of organization known as the Brigade de Cuisine, his rationalization of kitchen roles and tasks, streamlined food preparation in restaurants and hotels, allowing for greater consistency, speed, and scalability. Critical elements that would later influence the mechanization and standardization of food production on an industrial scale. Together, these innovations laid the groundwork for the modern global food industry, blending preservation, transportation, and efficiency. For these pioneers of the industrial food sector, fat was not a concern. Their focus was on helping people gain weight, not lose it. In the 19th century, food scarcity was a persistent issue, especially for those of modest means. Most people's diets were limited to grains and seasonal fruits and vegetables, as these were tied to natural growing cycles, and meat was a rare luxury. Traditional preservation methods like drying, smoking, fermenting, and pickling, though common, were unreliable, often compromising safety and flavor. This inadequacy became particularly evident during times of war, such as the French Revolutionary Wars. Faced with the challenges of feeding large masses of soldiers, the French army offered a prize of 12,000 francs for new food preservation methods, leading to Appel's popularization of canning. Later in the century, Charles Letellier, having witnessed the severe shortages during the Paris Commune, proposed a transformative idea. Steamships equipped with refrigeration could revolutionize French society by ensuring a steady supply of imported meat. He argued that this innovation would not only democratize meat consumption among civilians, but also strengthen the French army by providing reliable provisions. Despite early innovations, the industrialization of food in France, particularly the development of frozen food, stalled during the first half of the 20th century. While Clarence Birdseye, an American influenced by both French inventions and Inuit preservation methods, perfected fast freezing technology, several factors impeded its widespread adoption in France. Carrie Claflin highlights in her study of early 20th century refrigeration at Les Halles, market in central Paris, that resistance stemmed from concerns about preserving traditional markets, the high cost of equipment, and inadequate infrastructure for cold storage and transportation. Later, poorly frozen products from the Second World War tarnished the reputation of frozen foods. When the French trade journal La Surgélation was launched in the early 1960s, its editor acknowledged this lingering skepticism. Subsequent issues of the magazine identified further obstacles to the growth of frozen food in France, such as limited freezer space in urban apartments, which hindered the storage of frozen goods. Additionally, France's agricultural abundance and efficient distribution networks reduced the demand for preserved foods. In contrast to countries with shorter growing seasons, greater distances between production and consumption, or restricted access to arable land, France had less incentive to embrace frozen alternatives. Notably, early issues of La Surgélation gave little attention to cultural explanations for French resistance to frozen foods. Unlike the later discourse on fat anxiety at the close of the century, few articles attributed this resistance to concerns over the perceived loss of traditional foodways. Instead, the frozen food industry doubled down on the scientific benefits of its products, emphasizing the merits of rationalization and standardization. From the 1960s to the 1980s, French industry professionals strategically used scientific claims to overcome consumer resistance to frozen foods, emphasizing that fast freezing extended food availability beyond seasonal limits without preservatives and retained more vitamins than canned or even fresh foods. Numerous articles in La Surgélation promoted the superiority of frozen products by comparing their nutrient retention to fresh and canned alternatives, presenting them as not only convenient but scientifically superior. Moreover, the industry highlighted that standardized packaging controlled portions and, by extension, fat and calorie intake. Frozen foods were framed as a modern technology that perfected nature, offering products, quote, fresher than fresh, end quote, and capable of addressing the challenges of France's evolving social and economic landscape. As one contributor to La Surgélation suggested, French consumers would readily embrace frozen foods if they were made aware of the benefits. Describing the frozen food stand at the Paris International Food Expo, he wrote, quote, "The whole problem lies in knowledge. Let's open to the French, still children in this matter, the beautiful picture book that will teach them to read, to think, to know, and to believe in progress. This book is right before their eyes. The page is open. Frozen Foods at the International Food Exhibition, 1966, end quote. In response to this perceived gap in consumer understanding, the French Interprofessional Federation of Ultra-Rapid Freezing established an advertising commission in 1967, tasked with addressing the lack of coordinated marketing efforts. The commission aimed to launch 100 million advertisements by 1969. Even before this initiative, however, domestic cookbooks dedicated to frozen foods had begun to emerge. Frequently, they highlighted the scientifically validated benefits of these products. So Marie-Rose Verbugen's Les surgelés dans ma cuisine, or Frozen Food in My Kitchen, published in 1967 with medical guidance by Dr. Benoit Rieder, offers a compelling case for the health benefits of frozen food. Verbugen argues that freezing not only provides practical advantages, but also serves as an ideal method of preserving and even enhancing one's, quote, health capital, end quote. She devotes an entire chapter to explain the science behind fast freezing, distinguishing it from slow freezing, or la congélation in French, and highlighting its superior ability to preserve texture, flavor, and nutritional content. Her explanation reads more like a scientific text than a typical cookbook, delving into technical details about freezer temperatures, bacterial growth in cold storage, and how ice crystals damage cells. Verbugen also highlights the scientifically controlled nature of industrial freezing, where, according to her, rigorous assessments and advanced technology ensure the optimal preservation of food quality. She explains that agronomic advisors play a crucial role in this process, collaborating with farmers to evaluate crop ripeness before harvest. Large companies, she notes, commit to purchasing entire harvests based on strict quality standards. Once crops reach peak ripeness, they are tested, she tells readers, and if approved, they are harvested and frozen within hours. Over the next 2 decades, other domestic cookbooks focused on frozen food were published, many of which, like Verbugen's, included detailed discussions of the scientific and technical properties that make frozen foods, quote, better than fresh, end quote. They were similarly authored by medical professionals or included interviews with experts in the field. In La cuisine des conserves et surgelés, the cuisine of preserved and frozen foods, published by Larousse in 1968, the author, a licensed dietitian, offers an extended discussion of a law regulating frozen food packaging. She explains that effective packaging must prevent weight loss due to desiccation and protect against oxygen, light, and odors. Heat-sealable packaging, she goes on to say, is preferred for ensuring closure, while thin materials are ideal for rapid cold transmission. Readers learned that commonly used materials include cellophane, polyethylene, and flexible composites, which allow for transparency, printability, and reheating. Once again, such technical details seem strangely out of place in a cookbook intended for home use. By the 1980s, cookbooks began to present frozen foods as a tool for weight management. In 1987, Picard published Excès de poids, la solution surgelée, excess weight, the frozen food solution, in which 8 health professionals, including doctors, nutritionists, and dietitians, advocated for the use of frozen foods to support weight loss. In the book's preface, titled At the Table of Good Sense, Professor Henri Bourg, introduced as a nutritionist and member of France's National Academy of Medicine, provides a broad overview of human nutrition. He explains that the past 50 years brought considerable dietary changes, with people in industrializing societies consuming significantly more animal products and far fewer plant-based foods. Bourg emphasizes that alongside these dietary shifts, the transition from a rural, labor-intensive society to an urban, mechanized one greatly reduced the need for physical exertion. Quote, today's consumers, he asserts bluntly, often eat too much because they have become well off, end quote. Bourg proceeds to list an array of resulting health conditions, from heart attacks and high blood pressure to cirrhosis, hemiplegia, digestive cancers, and type 2 diabetes. He argues that the solution to these ailments lies in better eating habits and increased physical activity. In his concluding remarks, he praises Picard, France's emerging leader in frozen foods, suggesting that the book, quote, proves that some leaders in the food industry and retail sector, in addition to their commitment to constantly improving product quality, are making a genuine effort in nutritional education, end quote. Around the same time that Picard's frozen food cookbook was published, other major brands like Findus and Marie began promoting light options, microwavable meals, low in calories and saturated fat. A 1986 Findus television commercial offers a striking example of this trend. The ad opens on a woman scowling at a table, facing a pot of what appears to be a rich, traditional French dish. For us, too many calories? Asks a voiceover. Another woman then bursts in, declaring it's over, as the lyrics introduce Findus's light cuisine line, with each meal containing under 300 calories. The second woman promptly removes the heavy dish, prompting her friend to choose a Findus light meal instead. After enjoying their low-calorie lunch, the two encounter a young man while playing racquetball. He enthusiastically approves of the Findus light dishes they later serve him. Both the commercial and Picard's cookbook are notable for refraining from attributing rising obesity rates in France to American dietary influences. Instead, Picard ascribes France's expanding waistlines to broader forces of industrialization and the sedentary lifestyle that has accompanied mechanized production processes. In contrast, Findus directly critiques traditional French cuisine by emphasizing its often high-calorie content. The advertisement strategically contrasts the woman's rejection of a substantial homemade meal with her preference for Findus's light options, positioning these industrially produced frozen meals as healthier, more desirable alternatives to classic French fare. The French frozen food industry continued to promote the health benefits of frozen products, advocating their scientifically proven superiority well into the 21st century. Major brands such as Findus, Marie, and Picard expanded their healthy eating lines, and until recently, Picard's retail locations reinforced this health-oriented messaging with an almost clinical ambiance. To an outsider, the stores might evoke a laboratory or an appliance showroom more than a place to buy food, with products organized in large white chest freezers accessible only from above. Employees outfitted in white coats and blue aprons resemble lab technicians rather than typical sales staff. However, beginning in the late 1980s, the industry also shifted focus to celebrate France's culinary heritage. Picard, for instance, dedicated a 7-month series in its customer magazine in 1995 to the diversity of French regional gastronomy, spotlighting iconic dishes like charolais beef, Dordogne foie gras, and Queen from Brittany. Likewise, Findus launched a traditions line of frozen meals, including Languedoc cassoulet, Alsatian choucroute, and Auvergnat petit salé, promoting them through television commercials that evoked nostalgia for regional cuisine. This dual emphasis on scientific authority and culinary heritage highlights a deeper tension between tradition and modernity that has shaped French culinary culture and French society at large since at least the 1970s, as noted by Benjamin Poole and others. In the 1970s, France's industrial and cosmopolitan ambitions increasingly clashed with the lingering impacts of decolonization, diminishing global influence, and mounting economic challenges. The frozen foods industry's simultaneous promotion of health-oriented products and nostalgic culinary traditions captures this friction, revealing an ambivalence in French culture as it sought to a redefined identity. In the 1990s, France grappled with a series of complex challenges, including the mad cow disease epidemic, heated debates over Islamic headscarves in public schools, and growing anxieties about national identity amid pressures from Islamic fundamentalism and European Union integration, which prompted the state to increasingly valorize culinary tradition as a source of cultural resilience and national pride, ultimately leading to its successful UNESCO petition in the first decade of the 21st century to recognize the, quote, French gastronomic meal, end quote, as a part of humanity's intangible cultural heritage. Yet it was precisely the demands of modern French life that prompted France to invent this culinary past, transforming regional and artisanal foods into symbols of identity and continuity. In this context, the frozen food industry's embrace of so-called traditional offerings may be interpreted as part of a broader cultural project aimed at stabilizing and redefining Frenchness in an era of globalization and rapid change. In the end, the French frozen food industry's navigation of tradition and innovation is not all that different from Mireille Guiliano's carefully curated vision of French identity in French Women Don't Get Fat. Both actors were engaged in what we might call selective tradition making, strategically emphasizing certain elements of French culinary culture while adapting to contemporary demands. Just as Guiliano repackaged French eating habits for an international audience seeking lifestyle guidance, frozen food professionals wove together narratives of French gastronomic excellence with modern convenience. There are apparent contradictions, simultaneously championing tradition while embracing industrial food production were not so much inconsistencies as they were strategic responses to globalization's challenges. This dynamic illustrates sociologist Zygmunt Bauman's keen insight about identity formation in a globalized context. When he suggests that, quote, identification wars, end quote, actually, quote, lubricate the wheels of globalization, end quote, we can see this process at work in the frozen food sector. Rather than representing a simple rejection of global influences or a pure preservation of tradition, these professionals' emphasis on Frenchness became a way to participate in global markets while maintaining distinctiveness. Their selective adaptation of tradition, much like Guiliano's work, demonstrates how local identities are not simply erased by globalization, but rather are actively constructed through it, creating new hybrid forms that both resist and facilitate global integration. Thank you.
I forgot.
Stop the camera.
That's it. While Lynn's doing that, I'll go ahead and give her introduction. Lynn Sharp is Assistant Professor of History at Whitman College. She earned her PhD at the University of California, Irvine, and gave her very first academic paper at the Western. In her words, too many years ago to admit. I will admit I've known Lynn even longer than that. She's also served as a member of the governing council of the Western Society. Her book, Secular Spiritualism, explored the 19th century's deep fascination with reincarnation and spiritualism in social and cultural terms. In her own scholarly reincarnation, Lynn has switched gears and followed her taste for cheese into the mountains, as well as the archives. Her current book project looks closely at moments when mountain cheeses we now call traditional solidified into their contemporary forms. This stems from the historical intersections of modernity, technology, and capitalism, but also with changing French visions of food and identity. Her paper today, Changing Cheese, the State and Dairy Production in Mid-20th Century France.
So I too am going to build on things that both have done. Oh, I will turn on the mic, which I promised I too. We'll talk about changing conceptions of identity and food, like Kelly and Jack have. I'm really excited by the term you just used, Jack. I'm going to use a different term, adaptive tradition, but it's linked. So, as we all know, the French state intervenes frequently and extensively in shaping and supporting French agricultural production. This paper looks briefly at two key moments in the production of pâte pressée cuite cheeses in the Est Central Mountains, both Jura and Alpes. The first period, 1876 to 1900 or so, focused mainly on improving the peasant. The second, from 45 to 85, focused more on improving land and production, but invoked methods and assumptions set by the earlier developments. That's why I linked the two. I will explore how the state and its various actors crucially changed the processes of cheesemaking during these periods. As the market took an increasing role, individual responsibility and savoir-faire lost value to the tenets of collective production based on scientific knowledge. In the earlier period, old habits of mind and making were decried as backward and of very little value. Heritage and tradition needed to be eradicated. In the latter period, however, tradition became a key value in marketing and promotion with the development of appellations d'origine contrôlée. And I will call them AOCs throughout, even though they are now PDOs, products of designated origin. I always forget that. I explore the ways in which individuals and institutions took advantage of institutional support to innovate in ways that supported certain visions of local culture. I contend here that a useful concept for thinking about heritage projects is that of adapted tradition. It allows us to explore the interplay between tradition and innovation as we follow developments that continuously change to fit new technical and social norms. The majority of this presentation focuses on Beaufort cheese in the Savoie, but we begin with the Jura and Gruyère de Comté, which saw the development of an ethos and a set of assumptions about making cheese. So, agricultural education and cooperatives. And I did actually put some pictures online. They're not crucial to the talk, but if you don't want to look at me, you can look at a picture of Poligny. The urge to improve, remake, and revivify the French countryside following the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune led to a series of laws on agricultural education. One result was the formation of various écoles d'agriculture suited to the products of their region. The first dairy schools were formed in this atmosphere at the request of departmental notables, hoping to see their local cheeses and butters better compete with imports from Switzerland and Belgium. The Ministry of Agriculture contributed funds to those raised by the respective departments in order to create these schools. Mamerol, first established in the Doubs in 1888, combined an experimental station laitière with an educational establishment for young rural men. These men learned the most up-to-date feeding of dairy cows and how to make cheese using the most modern equipment. They also learned to analyze the chemical content of milk, butter, and cheese, the science of fermentation, and detailed accounting for a commercial fruitière, or that's the local term for a fromagerie. The school at Poligny, that's the picture of that, established in 1891, originally aimed only to perfect cheesemaking through teaching apprentices the newest methods of production and introducing them through the use of new technologies as they appeared on the scene. However, it too became the scene of scientific experiment and development under its second director, the renowned reformer, I never can pronounce this word, Hyacinthe Friant, who ran the school from 1893 through 1925 and continued active in the cheese scene until his death in 1934. Friant was a student of Émile Duclos, himself a student of Pasteur, who continued his mentor's work. And it is really Duclos who does most of the work on milk. Pasteur gets the credit. Both schools, Friant insisted that his students would be fully trained in the rational conduct of dairying. Both schools emphasized scientific and rational dairying in order, and I should always put those terms in quote, scientific and rational, in order to countermand tradition, routine, and empiricism, which reformers blamed for the sad state of cheese. It's worth noting that both schools expanded and are now École nationale de l'industrie laitière, d'alimentation et l'environnement. I will refer to them as ENIL because that's what they were throughout most of the 20th century. Poligny in particular became a center of innovation and currently known as INLBio, promotes ongoing research on the chemistry and biochemistry of milk. Reformers' promotion of fruitière, so these are cooperative fromageries for area cheesemaking. This becomes a key plank in the reform platform. Traditionally, to make a Gruyère de Comté, which we now call, of course, just a Comté, right? Villagers pool their milk together because there wasn't enough to make the giant mountain cheeses, which you have to have a hard cheese to age to age well. So traditionally, villagers pooled their milk, took turns making the cheese. Depending on the skill of the producers, the quality varied incredibly. Fruitière moved the production of Comté cheese from a collection of locals to a talented professional. At first, Fruitière hired more experienced and knowledgeable Swiss makers, a key problem that the new dairy schools meant to solve. Reformers also designed model chalet or fruitière based on efficient production. Milk was collected daily and brought to the fruitière, and rules developed then to govern these co-ops, striving to create a predictable quality. This meant that only cow's milk could be used rather than a mix of cow and goat, as had often been common in the Jura. As these grew in size, traditional home-consumed cheeses began to disappear, these being the fruitière, not the cheeses. Control shifted to an executive board who hired the cheesemaker and developed the rules to improve the product. Directors railed against peasant women who skimmed the fat for butter before delivering the milk, and soon the practice was banned. Before much longer, women themselves were banned from even entering many of the fruitières. Apparently, they're a bad influence. Thus, although the traditional practice of pooling milk continues, and both female and male peasants lost control over their product. So I'm going to shift to the story of Beaufort, and if you go to the third picture, you get a little mountain porn, which might be entertaining. The practice of calling Alpine Gruyères Beaufort began around 1865 as part of an effort to differentiate French Gruyère from the more popular and well-known Swiss version. Swiss imports threatened both Comté and Beaufort in the late 19th century, especially actually the former, which sent much more cheese to market. Unlike Comté, Beaufort continued to be made in the more traditional manner, taking taking the cows to the high pastures, the alpage, from early June through late September throughout the early 20th century. Most pastures were owned by communities, and the inhabitants pooled their cows into herds of 50 to 80 in order to benefit from the fruits communs of the Grande Montagne. A grand cheese of 20 to 70 kilograms was made daily, then stored in caves down lower in the mountains. Alternatively, a private exploitation might take the form of a montagnard who bought or more often rented cows for the summer, right? Or he bought them and then the peasants bought them back in the fall. The montagnard would sell the cheeses themselves but pay the farmers in butter and pig products. So we use the milk, the petit lait, for the pigs. Some smaller alpages were privately owned, but the petite montagne tended toward making reblochon because they didn't have the herds necessary or the personnel to make Beaufort. Both systems, petite and grande montagne, were hostile to the institution of a cooperative fromagerie or fruitière, which envisioned year-round operation and required collecting the milk from individuals. So cheese making is generally a summer thing for Beaufort. Dairy reform then, through education, reached the Savoie in 1925 with the creation at the Fromagerie de Bourg-Saint-Maurice of a seasonal school destined to train fromagers d'alpage, thus continuing but enhancing the traditional model. By 1932, a new École nationale de l'industrie laitière had been established in La Roche-sur-Foron, which is actually in the Haute-Savoie near Annecy, and this school will feature later in our paper. True cooperatives didn't arise before the war, the Second War, but 1939 did see the creation of a Société Coopérative d'Affinage de Beaufort de Haute-Montagne. It aimed to bridge the gap between subsistence and market, between traditions of individuality and visions of collectivity. The co-op set up 4 caves d'affinage, one for each of the bassins laitières, and with the hope of creating a better quality cheese for a larger market. Because it didn't deeply challenge established methods, this resonated with local cheesemakers. They actually gained buy-in from all producers in the region of all 4 valleys, right? That's the Am, the Bourg-Saint-Maurice, Beaufort, and Moutier. Sadly, 1939 was not a good year for new projects. The World War II economy saw administrative and commercial centralization, and the alpagistes controlling more land and larger herds had more influence during the war, where the smaller farmers saw their needs as ignored. This led to tensions among Beaufort producers and meant an increasingly atomized production, with fewer and fewer people bringing cheeses to the collective, instead trying to market on their own, which was only marginally successful. Thus, at the end of the war, production was low and of poor quality. The wealth of the mountain people came from these cheeses, so they faced very hard times, making them amenable to change, which is key to later development. I am going to skip the interlude on cheese elsewhere in the 1920s, except to say industrialization moved rapidly in other areas of France. Industrialization of cheese following a model promoted by these reformers of collection of milk and factory production, right, of pasteurized cheeses and particularly milk, with the rise of city markets and with the development of the camion, the truck that can carry the milk back to the factory. Okay. As Venus Bivard has so richly illustrated, the post-war French state bet on agricultural modernization and bet big, promoting remembrement, new versions of modified crops, and mechanization throughout the countryside. One of the mechanisms for promoting this change was the Institut National de Recherche Agronomique, which was founded in 1946 with the explicit task of re-energizing and modernizing agricultural production to solve the immediate problem of food shortages. As the organization's historians put it, it was necessary to revive the agriculture of a wounded country. René Dumont, in his Problème agricole français, 1946, published before he became the architect of the Plan, set the objective expansion of technological transfer in order to improve productivity. Okay? Those are INRA's historians' words, not Dumont's. Modernization in the Savoie included much more than pressure toward new farming methods. Sarah Farmer has shown how the peasantry suddenly found their land in demand for the new version of France being built by the Délégation à l'aménagement du territoire et à l'action régionale, or DATAR. DATAR reoriented land toward projects deemed more profitable. The early 1960s saw the development of La Plagne, the first ski area aimed at mass tourism. And it was built on working agricultural territory amid the Savoie's alpage. Okay? Even more destructive, Beaufort cheese production was literally swamped by progress. In 1955, the state began construction of the Rosalind Dam, just 5 kilometers east of the town of Beaufort, in the pass leading to Bourg-Saint-Maurice, which connects 2 of the 3 main Beaufort producing valleys. Beaufort, Tang, and Tarentaise. Completed in 1962, the dam flooded some of the prime alpage of the region. In the post-war period, mountains that had traditionally been seen as undesirable and left to the peasantry no longer were. That trend, of course, continued with the formation of national parks. The first, Parc National de l'Arbre Vanoise, created in 1963, also includes and borders on several alpage territories. They were allowed to continue to be used, however, right, just to be clear. More generally, post-war modernization took the form it did everywhere else in rural France, of course, young people leaving the region. The French state pushed hard for change and to modernize the youth of rural areas, training them in new skills so they could contribute and make a better living. As one Savoyard youth described his experience in the 1960s, they truly discouraged everyone from agriculture because it was no longer viable. This was the epoch when they supported us to go learn a skill. Right after the army, a majority of the young men of Grenier all left for Pont-de-Clay, where there was a technical center. And Grenier lies very near La Plagne, where, again, we're in traditional alpage territory. Although the Institut National de Recherche Agronomique, which I will call INRA from now on, was part of the productivization process, not all its researchers saw that as the only path. One of the first labs to be created at INRA focused on animal husbandry and products. The Centre National de Recherche Zootechnique at Jouy-en-Josas became operational in 1951. Germain Mocot, already known for his work on the microbiology of milk, was recruited from Poligny to head this research. He left an indelible imprint on French cheese and on Gruyere in particular. Mocot worked at INRA from 1950 until his retirement in the 80s, and his work focused consistently on how to improve French cheese production through better understanding of the microbiology of milk. He consistently applied this toward safeguarding mountain cheeses against the mammoth players in the mountain, right? So he has and apparently, according to hearsay, he suffered in his career, didn't advance as far as others because of that. Without Germain Mocot, would we have Beaufort today? Nothing is less certain. So said Maxime Vialet, himself a major player in ensuring the future of Beaufort in the 60s and 80s. In 1947, Germain Mocot and others working at Poligny took up the question of how to improve the cheeses of the Beaufortin, especially Beaufort. The request for help came from Pierre Davoine, director of the Société Coopérative du Beaufort du Haute-Montagne, which faced declining production. Mocot made his way up into the Savoie, and there's a picture of him on his donkey with his umbrella, so you can see he was an intrepid traveler, to see how he might help. Mocot and the young Maxime Vialet met because Mocot used Maxime's parents' alpage as his source for information and experimentation. According to Vialet, Mocot, quote, knew everything about milk and how to treat it, and had useful advice suitable for every situation. His memory remains always graven in... Yeah, this is what he said, yeah. His memory remains always graven in the memory of those who encountered him. This visit was the first of many interventions that Mocot and his students made in Beaufort cheese production. They were fighting an uphill battle, however. As Violet put it, quote, "The development of technology put the agro-pastoral system in an embarrassing situation. Not only was it surpassed, but suddenly it became archaic." But we wanted to keep making Beaufort. The problem was with so many fewer people and cows, they could no longer use only milk from one herd, from one place, which is the tradition of making Beaufort. One herd, one place. But mixing milk from multiple places led to a mediocre and unpredictable cheese. Macot offered a straightforward solution, which became a model to follow throughout the rest of the 20th century. Keep the best of the ancestral forms of production, but introduce technical modifications to rigorously verify that the product remained a product of quality. They also worked to improve affinage. By integrating technological verification, Beaufort achieved a level, before the cheese, achieved a level allowing it to be sold as a product of quality. They succeeded at acquiring the appellation d'origine contrôlée in 1958, which is quite early, long before many other cheeses, and they found people to promote it. Even when pushed, not all young men wanted to leave the mountains. A current of modernizing youth, springing from the peasant-run Jeunesse Agricole Chrétienne, decided to remain and rebuild, or rather build a new version of traditional production. They had been imbued with modern thinking and were no longer willing to, quote, submit to economic subservience. Instead, they educated their friends and incessantly lobbied elected officials for support. In addition, the dam at Roseland and other losses of alpage forced the previously separate montagnards and petite agriculteurs de moyenne montagne, in other words, two classes, to work together, thus greatly diminishing the corrosive tensions that we saw during World War II. Makers of Beaufort throughout the three valleys also finally capitulated to the collectivist pressure and established a true cooperative. In 1960, in the canton of Beaufort, makers bought the cave d'affinage and created that cooperative fromagerie. The fromagerie succeeded, acting as a convincing example to others who soon followed. In 1965, the JAC managed to hold several meetings of producers, which led ultimately to a union of cooperatives, the Union des Producteurs de Beaufort, UPB. The UPB acted, and still does, to promote the AOC Beaufort as intermediary between producers and officials. The 1960s saw rapid expansion of production, but only about 50% of Beaufort that reached the level of quality of the AOC. Right? So Macot sent his students and Gerard Grosclos, among others, to develop solutions. One major problem was the lack of skilled workers, especially for milking. Grosclos took the question back to the mechanical workshop at Juin-Zosa, and they came up with a solution, a mobile milking machine. And I've got a picture of a mobile milking machine there for you. It can be towed by a tractor across the steep slopes of the alpage, which allows for more rapid milking with fewer people. It also ensured that manure did not end up concentrated in a few places, but is spread throughout the alpage to good advantage. The machine was a game changer, solving multiple problems and allowing for greater production while improving the soil. It debuted in the summer of 1974, and continually improved versions followed. Thus, the early 1970s began a deeper integration between INRA engineers and Beaufort cheesemakers. 1975 also saw the formation of a Syndicat de Défense de Beaufort, which Maxime Violet headed, which regulated all of the producers, acting not as a cooperative per se, but as a source of consistent oversight. It, along with the Union des Producteurs de Beaufort, insisted on the quality checks designed by Macot and his students to ensure conformity to the level required to be commercially. So what we see then, and I have more, but I'm running out of time, just a quick note to connect these papers. In the late 1970s, we also see the rest of France begin to share the idea that tradition had to be safeguarded. right? The retour à la terre of the 1970s, the French urban youth, which helped stimulate a real sense that much of the wealth of France lay in its food production. In addition, the state begins to promote French identity through heritage products as part of a program to combat urban malaise. Marianne de Maussier notes, from 1978, the Ministry of Culture deliberately encouraged the promotion of the past as a means to, quote, follow Ariadne's thread uniting past, present, and future, and allow it to escape anguish and sterility. The year 1984 saw the decision to create an inventory of regional food and cuisine, quote, defined as a cultural and economic inventory of traditional and regional food cuisine. And this has led to 22 volumes of the Inventaire du patrimoine culinaire de la France. This movement also leads to more promotion of AOCs, right? And urbanites sharing what the people of the mountains already knew, the wealth of France lies in its land. However, it also solidifies a vision of other, that the heritage world is other and different, right, than the urban world. That limits the understanding of how products are made and also the world in which they're made, right? As we've seen in this paper, the traditional means of making Comté, and especially Beaufort, has changed across the long 20th century. The process of making Beaufort now involves sterile labs and white coats as much as it does open air and mountain flowers. I'm currently intrigued by the term adapted tradition, which I've seen used by anthropologists to discuss the ways that traditional healers from Palestine to the Andes fit into modern societies without losing their connection to an ancestral past. I think this might help us move away from ideals of unchanging practices and ancient savoir-faire into a more realistic and nuanced relationship between consumer and producer, and a more nuanced understanding of rural ecology and what needs to be done to preserve not only products, but the places they're made. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Lynn. We have time for discussion. I think, yes. This is what I thought. When we have discussion from the audience, there will be a microphone. This is not to amplify your voice, but to record it for those purposes. I think if it's okay, the method I'm going to use a little bit is we'll take a question. It could be directed towards somebody, but then I think I'll ask if the other panelists have something to say or to follow up on before then going on to the next one, so it becomes more of a discussion. Okay. Yeah, thank you for being patient.
Do I need to show this on? I just want to start. Just a question for John. I mean, it seems, based on my understanding of the presentation, you're talking a lot about kind of the internal market, like advertising in the French language for French consumers. But I'm wondering kind of in building off of the other, like how, especially after 45, kind of agricultural exports become so central to the French economy, the government wants it to be, it does. Like how this kind of the tension on globalization tradition, does the presentation look different when these companies are trying to export or present themselves kind of either to European market, American market, post-colonial markets where French agriculture dominates so much? I'm just wondering, how does this presentation technique, technology, whatever, look when it's not about the domestic market but the international market? And does the French tradition play the same role? Is it adapted? Is it different? Just kind of curious about that.
Great question, thank you. I don't have too much information. It's working. Too much information. And I'm focused on kind of the notion of French identity and how that's playing out with this marketing and the development of the frozen food industry in France. I do have some anecdotal information. When frozen food began to take off in France, the production of frozen food, more of it was consumed outside of France than it was actually inside of France. And so a lot of frozen food professionals had long discussions about that. How can we build up the domestic market because so much is being exported? In the 1970s is when frozen meals really started to emerge, meals that were already prepared. And at that point, there was some discussion about kind of building on France's reputation as a culinary powerhouse and kind of selling French gastronomy abroad, prepackaged, frozen, and kind of, working with this understanding that the rest of the world has about French food. So that's partly maybe an answer, a beginning of an answer to your question, but I don't have too much information on that. It's really great.
I could just build really quickly on that. The big push for AOCs comes in 1990, as we're looking at the 1992 European Union, right? So it's that sort of French identity is now threatened by uniting. It's not marketing, but it is marketing, because it's like we're still France, right? Kind of what you were pointing at, Kelly.
I was going to say, this is not based on this, but I wrote an article about couscous and Orientalism in couscous advertising, and I read a journal by American advertisers about like how to market in France versus how to market elsewhere. And I'm happy to share the link with whomever, but they basically said that France is a specific case because in France what you really want to do if you want to sell something is tell a story and specifically appeal to like romance, sex, and history, like specifically, and so like, and they also specifically said in the United States, do not talk about history, which here we are. But I do think, to your answer, like, yes, there are very different strategies, but it's about like creating a very specific French identity as well.
Oh, Whitney, go ahead.
Oh, Whitney.
All right, thank you. Thanks for this terrific panel. And they were all remarkably united by, modernization versus, French tradition, identity with tradition. So my question has to do, it mostly comes from what Kelly and John were saying, but it might have some bearing to Lynn's, but it's about the kind of the social developments, like women working. Do they no longer have time to cook? I mean, it was so interesting because here Kelly tells us that these social workers are saying, well, all French women know how to make potage, but then are they going to buy frozen meals? So I think I'm interested in what you have to say about social developments with women working outside of the home, maybe not having enough time to cook. And the other thing is, and John mentioned this in your paper, about the storage space for frozen food. I mean, French refrigerators are so minuscule. They have very little space for this. And so how do they do this? Thank you.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. So I've been working on this project, and actually John and I have a lot of overlap on that, and one of the chapters is specifically about this question of like, well, what about white French women working? Like they're also very concerned about diet. And so similarly to the women who are coming from elsewhere, like the white French women are also the target of massive amounts of attention for their cooking habits now. And a lot of it, my interpretation is there's a subtext here of like it's actually not that more women are working, but more mothers are working. And so there's a real fear that they will no longer be preserving the traditions of France. And so this language of tradition comes up again of like, oh, you're getting rid of something that's eternal, when we all know it's not really eternal, and that their choices now will impact the future of France by children, in terms of children. And so the rhetoric about like fatness becomes really potent at the time of like, not only are mothers not cooking these like traditional long simmering, beef bourguignon or whatever, but they're serving their kids these meals that are going to then make them fat. And then what will be the difference between France and the United States? And then Giuliano comes along and answers it.
So what I found in my research, this is a really interesting question, thank you. there's a lot of concern in this trade journal that women just don't know how to cook anymore. There was many articles that said, frozen food is a solution because you can give raw products that people can use to cook, like frozen vegetables. But at the same time, these women might not know how to put these vegetables together into a dish. And so you can freeze sauces, for example, and they talk about the different sauces that are part of French cuisine and how that's really practical. So it's a lot about convenience. It's about this fear of losing the ability to cook, especially for women. It's also about luxury, the way they're marketing it. So in the 1980s especially, commercials emerged that really focused on using food as increasing choice, for example. So it's a way to promote a happy marriage because the husband might want one dish and the woman might want another dish. The children might want another dish. And so there's this luxury. I'm thinking of this one commercial where it shows like this whole team of domestic servants kind of presenting frozen food, individual frozen food to different members of the family, as if having frozen food can replace having domestic workers. So it's about luxury. It's about choice. It's also, as I said, about this kind of fear of losing culinary knowledge. In terms of working, in the 1970s, a lot of commercials emerged as well. And in those, you do see some women in the workforce. I'm thinking of another commercial where this woman's talking on the phone. She's at her office, but she's not paying attention to the conversation, the professional conversation she's having. Instead, she's kind of daydreaming about what she's going to serve her family for dinner when she gets home. And of course, frozen food comes to the rescue. She can think of, this dish that's perfect, and her family's going to adore her for it. So it sort of shows women outside of the home working, but working still not their principal role, or it's not supposed to be their principal role. It's still supposed to be about feeding their families, and frozen food can help to that end.
Not much to add, just that part of the, as part of the whole inventory of culinary patrimoine, they actually promoted classes for school children to have them taste this food, right? And I remember I was talking to some cheesemakers, as one does, and they were like, well, we have to re-educate the children on what cheese really tastes like, because they are getting this industrial crap, and they don't know what it should taste like. So that's not exactly the same. It's not directly related to women working, but it's directed to that loss of.
No, it's so
Yeah. Everyone has questions.
I know. Well, we have questions because it was really a great panel. I mean, I learned a lot, and I have so much to think about. But unlike Whitney, who has this wonderful overarching question to pull it together, I have 3 specific questions, but maybe, when the women are pushed out of this production, bless you, I'm wondering about, there's the work of, I think it's Thérèse Moreau-Lussin, I'm going to forget the name, but it says, and also the Love and Marriage in the Peasant Family, about women, the relationship of the menstrual cycle to food pollution. And I'm just wondering if there's any, or if that's worth pursuing, or if there's any of that discussion around that. And Jack, is there, and these are out there questions, so I apologize for this, but it just provokes these thoughts. In the discourse about, and the concern and anxiety about obesity, is there any attention or any awareness of eating disorders in that? And I mean, it comes up in the literature. Women are writing novels and short stories about it, but does that come up? And Kelly, who were these assistants? Where did they come from? What was their class background, their educational background? How were they situated and envisioned? And thank you.
Okay, so let's just go down the line.
The menstruation, not directly, but pollution, as in polluted by ignorance, right? Women's ignorance of not knowing how to make proper scientific butter, right, was getting in the way of making good scientific cheese, right? So yeah. And maybe on a side note, the GAEC, which I don't even know that's how you really pronounce it, GAEC, which is you can have a formation of it's an institutional thing given by the state where you can have a groupement agriculture. It's an investment, right? You can bring people together who form a little company, right? But everyone has to agree to do it, and many families use it to keep their land in the family. And it's an opportunity for women to come back into power in the mountains, right? Because you have these chalets up in the Alps where tourists come and women sell their cheese, people sell their cheese to them, and women are the hosts of all of that mass tourism in many ways. Yeah.
That's a really good question about eating disorders. So in terms of my sources, what I'm working with, it's this trade journal, La Surgélation, which has been published since the 1960s through the 1990s. Television commercials, customer magazine. Picard has a customer magazine that they've been producing since at least the end of the 1970s. And then these cookbooks. I haven't found anything about eating disorders, but when they're talking about obesity, the discussion always tends to go to the notion of bien-être, and they're talking about health. So Picard, beginning in the 1980s, had a whole column that appeared in its customer magazine that lasted through, I think, the end of the 1990s, where they would talk about that every time. And strangely enough, when we're talking about frozen food, preserving food that can be used anytime, they talk a lot about seasonality and kind of following the rhythms of the seasons. And that's what they tend to promote. If you go into their stores and you look at what's on promotion at any given season, it's seasonal foods. So kind of reverting back to seasonality, but it's much more convenient because the vegetables are already chopped for you. You can take those frozen sauces and mix them how you want. But it always kind of returns to this notion of bien-être, and it's kind of this naturalness linked to seasons.
Yeah. I pulled up the project because I didn't want to get this wrong, dude. I was like, oh no. So they were nurses in World War I. And then the nurses got out of the war, and then it was like, well, what do we do now? And many of them wanted to keep working. And then the officials in the French government started to standardize their training, and all women received this kind of tripartite training to be nurses, and one of the parts of it was basically what we would call social work. And then at a certain point, I think in the 30s, it separates from the nursing profession and becomes labeled its own profession in the 1940s, which brings it certain legal status and protections and things like that. But it's this group of, I think 95% women, and during this time period, 95% white women, and they're generally lower middle or middle class women who are doing this. Yeah.
And then,
I couldn't remember.
Yes, we'll get both of you in.
So thank you for this great panel. These are such fascinating papers. And I wanted to pick up on the point that Kelly had mentioned, and then Lynn, you came back to as sort of a unifying question about taste. And so Kelly, I thought it was really interesting when you had the question or the comment about the children sort of learning to love vegetables, right? Because they were finally cooked in this right way, and thinking about this much longer history of sort of training the tongue. And then Lynn, you were just talking about that. So I was wondering, what is this discourse? Your papers have all emphasized the sort of scientific, the modernizing, the efficiency of the producers and the people who are making the food. But what's the flip side of that discourse in terms of educating the consumers and the tongue to recognize either the frozen food as a legitimate, real, the real food, and how that fits into discourses of authenticity, consumer expertise, and maybe the elasticity of the tongue as a sort of marketing tool?
Oh, you want to go?
Whichever. Sure. So thank you for your question. And Jack probably knows a lot about this too, as McDonald's becomes a problem in France, there's all of this fear, again, Whitney was talking about children, and what are we doing about our children? And the idea that children love these very standardized, uniform taste experiences now, and they have no palate anymore. And I read all these debates about when McDonald's started offering the toys and Happy Meals. It was oh my God, no. no more. And Jack Lang, who was the Minister of Culture, started to integrate into public schools like classes on taste in order to try to get children to no longer like McDonald's and to prefer like traditional foods. And so like the government was very concerned, and it was painted as a failure on the part of mothers for not teaching their children how to why not
Always.
for not teaching their children how to like cook properly, how to think about food properly, sitting in front of the television, things like that. And so it was sort of like, well, if they're not going to do it right, the government is going to take over. So they devoted huge amounts of money to this, like giant portions of the budget to this. And then in the end, I remember reading this article where, it may have been a TV interview where Lang was being interviewed, and he's like, and don't you really like this food? And the kid's like, sure, but I prefer fries.
That's okay, those are French.
So I'm not sure, but I think it's a great question because it was truly like top of mind at the time.
I mean, for my people, it hasn't changed, right? That's the key, is that the taste of the cheese hasn't changed, right? Now, are people going to like it? I think for them, it's just like, well, évidemment, right? It is a product of quality, and people are going to like it, So there's not a lot of discussion other than like kind of this anecdotal stuff that I had. But I do have had anecdotal things where it's like kids don't know how to eat cheese anymore. People don't know how to appreciate cheese, right? So I haven't seen it officially.
Yeah, I mean, so in the frozen food sector, certainly certain foods are marketed more towards children than adults. I'm thinking of like fish fingers, fish sticks, I guess you call them, and French fries. But it's really marketed toward children. Even peak out around back to school time, they usually have an issue that's linked to the United States. They used to at least link it directly to the United States and saying this is, convenience food that's really great when kids are going back to school because they're tired, parents are tired, so it's something you can feed your kids really quickly, but it's kids, it's not meant for adults. And it tends to be discussed as sort of a parenthesis, kind of a break from your traditional eating habits. It's okay for this specific time of the year. Right, la rentrée, exactly. When everyone, just needs a little extra help. But then, you should go back to the straight and narrow path of French eating. You shouldn't, let yourself, go too
like
far.
The Americans.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Patiently waiting.
That's fine. Thank you. Just a quick comment in view of the very most recent discussion. As far as McDonald's is concerned, for a long time, and you may know this, McDonald's sold more hamburgers in France than any country except the United States. So it was number 2, despite, and you may remember in the mid-90s, José Bové trashing McDonald's. There's a whole history of this, and don't get me started. I'll go on forever. But more recently, France is now number 3. Japan has moved into the second place as far as McDonald's consumption, McDonald's sales is concerned. My question, though, is, I guess, more oriented toward Lynn, but really I think all of you, when talking about these issues of food, and, okay, I can't resist one other comment before I pose my question, having worked in food history for quite some time. It's fascinating to see, and I was thinking as listening to the presentations, that somebody might actually do a history of food history itself, because, going back to the 1970s, and this has to do with gender, obviously, as well, but history was diplomacy, war, politics, etc. And just one anecdote, I remember talking about introducing a food history course, I won't mention the university, and being I guess it was in the 70s, and being called a huckster for wanting to do this. And, we laugh at it now, but we can see the changes really in our own field, which, are very, very welcome. Anyway, my question, I told you I'd get to this eventually, and that is, as I was listening really to all of your talks, and I think perhaps even especially to the last one, to Lynn's, I was thinking of Hobsbawm Hobsbawm's invention of tradition, and I was wondering whether that resonated, or whether you people have explored this sort of thing. We talk about traditional foods in France, elsewhere as well, but we're focused here on France, and going back, etc., that so many of these traditions, AOC and whatever, essentially are what Hobsbawm called inventions of tradition. I just wondered if anybody had any comments on that.
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely thought about that, right? And the sort of intersections between invented traditions and traditions, right? And the Hobsbawm's invented traditions had bases, in fact, too, right? They weren't, but I think that the main difference there is the narrative of loss that's going on, or the worry about loss. I mean, I'm not sure that, it's been a while since I read my Hobsbawm, so I'm not sure that that's also there in that, right? The sense of losing the tradition and needing to maintain it, right? So it's that need to maintain, I guess, is also in Hobsbawm. So yeah. I think the cheesemakers would like to say it's not an invention, right? But it is an invention that the rest of France cares about it, that it's a French thing rather than a Savoyard thing. And of course, the Savoy, part of this move in the Savoy is because it's now French. It's only been French since 1860, right? So, that's also an interesting thing. That's not really an answer, it's some thoughts. Either of you have?
I've thought a lot about it as well. And that's kind of what my paper was about, right? It's kind of tracing, what I'm interested in the construction of French national identity. French national identity is no one thing. But according to these frozen food professionals, it was all about modernization, it was all about science, it was all about technology, the ways they define those terms. But then all of a sudden it was also about tradition. It was kind of inventing or kind of, I guess, commandeering these different dispersed regional traditions and all of a sudden calling it French. And so they are inventing something in some way, right? But I think it was in this context of loss, so I think that's a really important distinction to this perceived loss, right? Yeah. They feel like they're losing something. So I think that's an important distinction to make.
That's a great question. And for me, anyway, like thinking about the time period that I'm looking at, which is really the 1970s and 1980s, and a little bit into the 90s, there's so much social change that's happening during that time. There's so much immigration. There's the demographic shifts and things like that. And I think that question undergirds a lot of it, because it's like, well, who gets to maintain tradition? What does tradition mean to you, and who's allowed to actually claim that mantle? And if you're looking at, Paul Bocuse and the Nouvelle Cuisine chefs, no women, not allowed, but on the flip side of that is cuisine de mer, and women have to maintain that tradition, and yet then, what does it mean to be French, and are immigrant women allowed to maintain their tradition? So I think it's a really multi-layered question about who gets access to this mantle of tradition, and if they don't, why don't they get access to it? So it's a great.
That's an excellent point.
I'm circling it.
Well, I want to...
we have to get his... he's been waiting patiently. You've been waiting patiently. No? Oh, you were just pointing at her. Oh, okay. I thought you were trying to get attention.
I'm sorry.
Great.
Just very, very quickly,
sure.
Your last comment reminds me
Your last comment reminds me of the distinction between a chef and a cook. And there's your gender distinction right away. Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank all of our panelists. As everybody has said, these are wonderful papers. Thank you very much. It's now time for lunch. I do want to remind everyone that at 2 o'clock is the Ned Newman Memorial Plenary